A 9-year-old boy was asked by his mother one day what he had learned in Sunday school. And he said, "Well, Mom, our teacher told us how God sent Moses behind enemy lines on a rescue mission to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. When he got to the Red Sea, he had his engineers build this huge bridge, and all the people walked across the Red Sea. He then uses his military-grade walkie-talkie to radio in and get the B-52 bombers to blow up the bridge. And, Mom, all the Israelites were saved and all the Egyptians were destroyed." Well, as you can imagine, his mom looked rather puzzled at him and said, "Now, Billy, is that really what your teacher taught you?" To which Billy replied, "Well, actually, no, Mom. But if I told you the story the way my teacher did, you'd never believe it." You've got to admit that from a human perspective, it's a pretty unbelievable story, isn't it? I mean, here was Moses with Pharaoh's army chasing him on one side, the massive Red Sea on the other side, and an impossible mountain range on the other. And we all have phrases that we tend to use to describe those particular types of situations, don't we? You know what I'm talking about, when we're stuck in the middle, really not knowing what to do. We sometimes say that we're between a rock and a hard place, or it's a catch-22, or maybe we say that we're between the devil and the deep blue sea. And it's when we are in a place where none of our options really seem like good options that we tend to ask ourselves, how did we end up here? We know that that's exactly what the Israelites were asking their leader in this moment. They were asking Moses why it was that he had led them there. And if you've been a follower of Jesus for any length of time, then you know that God often leads his people into situations that don't make any earthly sense. And his ways are not logical by our standards or by our definition. As we script our own journey and our life, I mean, our plans usually include the shortest distance between 2 points, don't they? I'm going to graduate high school and go to Bible college and then become a pastor. I'm going to meet the person of my dreams, fall in love, get married, and then we're going to live happily ever after with 2.3 kids. I'm going to start a successful business, make a lot of money. I'm going to retire young and then sail into retirement, living a long and healthy life. And it's true, isn't it, that our own plans usually include the shortest distance between 2 points. But God's route is rarely linear. And I think that that's partly, anyways, why some people might start off strong in their faith. But when a crisis hits or they are thrown some kind of a curveball, they so often start to look for an off-ramp. And they do that because it's sometimes hard to trust a God who would willingly allow us to walk into a crisis as part of our journey and as part of his plan for us. And the story that we're going to be looking at this morning is a perfect example of that principle. And let's face it, I mean, right after God had demoralized the Egyptians by sending the plagues, and after God had delivered Israel from Egypt, and after he had led them out of slavery, the Israelites were probably feeling pretty invincible in that moment. But what they would soon learn is that, again, this is from a strictly earthly perspective, but God was leading them right into a trap. They found themselves panned in between the mountains on one side, the desert on another side, and the Red Sea on another. And to make matters worse, the Egyptian army was coming. And from their vantage point, this was no reasonable strategy for escape. But God knew exactly what was about to happen. And this is exactly where Israel needed to be for reasons that they would only fully come to understand years later. And God didn't need their assistance in that moment. He only needed their obedience. He was in total control of the situation and only needed their surrender to him for his plan to work perfectly. And what's fascinating as you read through this story in Exodus chapter 14 is that in the midst of this tremendous pressure, God only gave his people a few very simple commands. And he gives them the first command in verses 10 to 12. And this is what we read. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Now, I know that it's easy for us to read that and to be critical of the Israelites for responding that way. I mean, after all, just imagine, just think about what they had been through with God in the last few weeks. Just days earlier, they had miraculously seen the plagues. They had been a part of the spreading of the blood over their door frames. And they had marched probably 2 million strong out through the great gates of Egypt as free people. But keep in mind that they had been slaves for more than 400 years. And that's all they really knew how to be. They didn't know what it was like to live as free people. They didn't know anything but a life of being told what to do, when to eat, when to sleep, and when to wake up. So, admittedly, they react quite poorly when they are faced with this first big test. And Moses, he addresses this and he gives the people their first command. And he tells them this, starting in verse 13. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid," he said. "Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring to you today." So the first command that he gives the people is, do not be afraid. When Israel saw Pharaoh and the Egyptian army barreling down on them, they were afraid. They were scared. And as a lot of people do, when they are scared, they look at the one who led them there. And they said, "What were you thinking, Moses?" They were a bit more colorful and sarcastic in what they said. In fact, they said, "So what is it? There weren't enough graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" I've often wondered how Moses internalized that, or if he did. I wonder if he was hurt by it. I wonder if he was discouraged as a leader by that. But they weren't finished. They went on to say, "It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." And again, you have to wonder what was swimming around in Moses' head as they were blaming him. I think Moses realized that the people didn't know any better. And in a lot of ways, even though they had seen God work in some miraculous ways, and even though they had watched God deliver them from the hands of their oppressors, they were still infants in their faith. And you don't expect babies to do grown-up things, do you? You don't expect children to always make wise decisions. And you don't expect people who really don't know God to understand his ways. He knew that they were afraid. In fact, in verse 10, it uses a different word. It uses the word terrified. They lost their composure and their despair had immediately taken over them. And they began to cry and they began to blame Moses and God for the predicament that they were in. And in that moment, they lost faith in God and they lost their hope of being delivered. And they began to be afraid because their eyes were focused on the problem. And I mean, let's be honest with one another. I mean, often we're not that different. When our pressure point becomes our focal point, we inevitably lose hope. Let me say that again. When our pressure point becomes our focal point, we inevitably will lose hope. That's exactly what happened to Peter after a few steps out of the boat. Do you remember that story? He began to sink when his attention was drowned out by the waves and the storm. But Moses addressed the people plainly and bluntly. And he told them, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance that the Lord will bring you today." And he even tells them why they don't have to be afraid. He tells them that they don't have to be afraid because the Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. That's verses 13 and 14. 99 times in Scripture, we are told not to fear. And you'd think that we would have learned that by now. We need not worry when Christ is the one that is truly in control. So the first command was, do not be afraid. The second command that Moses gives the people is stand firm. In fact, he says in verse 13, stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The ASV puts it this way. It says, stand still and see the salvation of Jehovah. The complete Jewish Bible puts it this way. Remain steady and you will see how Adonai is going to save you. The CEV puts it this way. Be brave and you will see the Lord save you today. These Egyptians will never bother you again. The ESV says, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. And the Message puts it this way. Stand firm and watch God do his work of salvation for you today. And Moses was telling the people that in the midst of their fear, that they needed to sit back, stand firm, and watch the same God who had just days before delivered them work out his plan. I think we'd all admit that one of the hardest things for us to do is to stand still when we're surrounded by a crisis. Our natural tendency is what? Our natural instinct is fight or flight, right? So many people today look for a quick, easy way out. They look for an easy way out of their marriage. They look for an easy way out of their job. They look for an easy way out of their church. And yet it's interesting to look at that from the perspective of the Israelites in this story. I mean, where else would they go? It's obvious that they were tempted to run, but where would they run to? Where did they have to run to? They could try and cross the desert, but the Egyptians were coming from that direction. They could try and climb the mountains, but they certainly weren't even close to being prepared for that. They could try and swim the Red Sea, but that wouldn't have gotten them far. And yet still, they were tempted to run. Maybe you and I aren't that different. There are times when we all are tempted to run. The plain truth is that God is always with us. And like the story of Peter that we talked about a few minutes ago, we have nowhere else to go. The prophet Jonah tried to run, but quickly realized that God never leaves. He's always there, and he's always watching. And I love what Moses records in verse 15, because as much as the Israelites needed a rescue plan, they also needed to be assured that God was still with them. They needed to be assured that they weren't facing this crisis alone. And in verse 15, God answers all of that for them. And this is what we read. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out at me? Tell the Israelites to move on." Verse 16, "Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." And moving down to verse 19, it reads like this. Then the angel of God who had been traveling in front of Israel's army withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. Verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Can you picture that? I mean, I think that the Israelites just needed the assurance that God was still with them, and they certainly got it, didn't they? They needed to know that he wasn't watching this event from a distance. And what we learn is that he was with them. He was down with his people on their level. throughout this entire ordeal. And please don't lose sight of why God was doing all this. Yes, he did it to save the nation of Israel, but this event was a precursor to everything else that he was going to call them to do. You know, if you go to a synagogue today, devout Jewish people will tell you that this was the defining moment for the nation of Israel. It was a defining moment in Israel's history. And God did this so that they would know that he was the one true God and that he was worthy of being worshipped. We read in verse 19 that God says this, "I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh and his chariots and his horsemen." So this was a defining moment for the nation of Israel, a moment that they were to remember and keep remembering so that there would be no doubt at all at who the one true God really was. So the first command was, do not be afraid. Second command was to stand firm. And the third command that we read in verse 14 was simply, don't fight. And this was quite possibly, and for us too, maybe the most difficult of all of these commands. We read in verse 14 that God said through Moses, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." Some translations record this a little differently, and they record it as, "Hold your peace. Do not defend yourself. The Lord will fight for you. Do not retaliate. The Lord will fight for you. Do not fight for yourself. Let God be your defense," another translation says. And again, put yourself in their shoes for a moment. They'd already seen God deliver them with 10 mighty plagues. They'd already seen God deliver them with his guiding column of fire and the cloud. And now, here they were, watching as the Red Sea parted. In Psalm 77, verse 17, David writes about this event, and he reminds the people that your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footsteps were not seen. Those footsteps weren't seen. He was certainly seen. His activity was. And it's true. All the Israelites had to do was choose in that moment to obediently not fight. They needed to let the Lord fight this battle. And all they needed to do was to watch and wait and see God work. I think our urge is to fight. I think sometimes that's connected to our need to control, isn't it? I mean, we wrongfully think that if I don't fight, nobody will. But God says something very different. This story picks up in verse 23, and we're told just how it was that God fought for the Israelites. And listen to this. "The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea." And I love this next part, because just hear how involved God was in this fight. "During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud and the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion." Verse 25. "He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, 'Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt.'" Verse 26. "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and their horsemen.' Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived." Verse 29. "But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, The people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. So tell me, what does it take for you to truly trust God? The Israelites were spiritual infants in a lot of ways, and God wanted to use this event as a defining moment to let them know that he could be trusted. And I wonder sometimes if God brings situations into our lives as well, so that he can confirm to us that we can put our trust in him. Trust is such an essential building block for all of us, isn't it? We know that if kids don't learn to trust early on, we're told that they will grow up to have all kinds of problems. And in the same way, if followers of Jesus don't learn to trust him early on in their journey, well, we are limited in what he can do in and through us. Maybe trust is best built in a defining moment where we are between a rock and a hard place, and there really are no good options. And maybe it's in those moments when we need to choose to not be afraid, to stand firm, and to choose to let God do the fighting for us. Lord bless. I pray that this has been a blessing to you and an encouragement to you. May he help you to take something from this and apply it to your daily life. Lord bless.